All right, Ernest here, and right now going to tackle a problem where I'd like the speed limit indicator to give the player some type of hint that they're approaching the speed restriction. So just to refresh your memory, if you're following along, once you get underway, if you enter a speed limit zone, you'll see here, I'll try to make the game view a little bit bigger, and you'll see that there's a speed limit of 3 knots. And there are various zones that trigger when the player drives over them. So for testing this, there's just a 3 knot speed limit zone, and the ship starts off in that zone. So right now, if I drive the ship, if I increase the speed, nothing really happens to kind of draw my attention. The speed limit sign is there. It's helpful if I glance over at it, but there's nothing interactive happening to gain, to make me pay attention to it. So what I'm thinking is, as the player goes faster, as their speed gets closer to the actual speed limit, then maybe that sign changes color. Maybe it starts approaching red, and then eventually will start, scaling to draw their attention. Okay, so I'm going to try to code that in and see if that is a little bit more visually stimulating. All right, so the layout here, I have the level UI panel. I'm going to look for that speed limit container. Here it is. I'll zoom in on it. So there's the speed limit container, its own separate game object, of course, on the user interface. And it has a piece of code attached to it, a script, called speed limit container. So if I open that, which I already have open here in Visual Studio, there's all kinds of game objects or properties. So in order to make this stand out, I'm going to have a separate section for it, give it its own header, and we'll call it the color gradient. Okay, so in order to have a gradient, I want to have a serialized field that's exposed to the editor, and Unity has these really cool properties already built in, or classes. This is a class called gradient, and I'll just call it my own gradient. So if I save that and I go back to the editor, the speed limit container actually creates a gradient field, and you can see that I've done this before, so there's actually a gradient already kind of set up. But what I like to do is just build this from scratch. So I'll just remove this. I'm just dragging these color fields away so that it's just a plain old white gradient. So I can delete that. Okay, so for the end color, I'll keep it red. But for the starting color, let's make it to be just the default white, which will keep the base color of the graphic. And then somewhere along here in the middle is where I want to have that yellowish color appear. So that looks about right. Normally, I would use a website to get some really cool color palettes. So one of my favorites is called Coolers. Okay, so I'm sure there are many more that folks use, but I kind of like this one. You can explore different color palettes, and that way you get down to the real specifics. So if I wanted a yellow and a red that went more together, I could possibly use one of these. Okay, but for the purposes of what I'm doing here, I think that looks good enough. Okay, I have a gradient that is now part of my script as well. And my logic is, as I'm thinking this out, I have a speed monitor that keeps track of the player's speed. And I actually have it already as a property in the speed limit container from previous videos. I'm going to use this speed monitor scriptable object because it keeps track of the player's speed constantly. Every update, every frame update, I'll have the player's velocity. Okay, so I'm going to use that to my advantage. There's a function that runs every frame. This void awake function right here on line 29, that runs when the script or the game object awakes. and then that's it. It's done until the player ends the session, and then they restart, and then that awake function will run again. The unenable when the game object is enabled or the script is enabled, and also undisable. So these typically run once during the gameplay. The function that I want that runs every frame, where I want to keep this evaluation of the gradient, is called update. So under awake, I'm just going to create that update function, and it's one of those Unity lifecycle methods that the Unity game engine runs every frame. Okay, and I touch on this a little bit in previous videos, but for now, the update function seems the best place for this. So I need a couple elements here, a couple properties that are temporary. I need the current velocity. So why don't I create a float that's going to hold my speed? I'll call it speed. Since I'm getting it in knots anyway, the speed monitor converts it, and when I access it, it comes back in from meters per second. It comes back as knots. So float speed will equal the speed monitor scriptable object, speed monitor scriptable object, and there's a property in it called speed in knots. And I'll also need another temporary one for, not sure what's going on with my autocomplete, but float. Now that I have the speed, I'm trying to think of what else I need to evaluate here. I have the speed in knots, and let me think about that. Oh, I also need the speed limit, right? So now that I know the player speed, I need to evaluate, well, what's the current speed limit? So let's just call it limit. We'll also get it from the speed monitor, and in there it keeps track of the current zone. If a player drives over a speed zone, then the speed monitor scriptable object gets that field or gets that property and keeps it current. Basically, it knows the last speed limit zone that it drove over. So I actually have that property in there called speed limit. And then we also need the percentage, right? Because I'm going to take the current speed, divide it by the speed limit, and that should give me a float or a decimal that translates to, okay, this is how much percentage of the speed limit that I've actually reached. So let's call that percentage will equal to speed divided by limit. So now that I have that value, I can use that percentage and I can evaluate it from our gradient. So the gradient, I'm going to open the gradient here. It goes from 0 to 100. The end value is 1. So 0 to 1. Okay. So if I get a decimal, the point that it reaches, that it evaluates to, will be the color that gets returned on the gradient. So I'm going to now assign the background color image, which is, if I look at my speed limit container, the background color is the white framing that's around. So if I use this color picker and I move that around, you'll see that the background color is changing. So by default, to show at the native graphics color, I just make it all white. But what my gradient is going to do, like as it approaches yellow, you'll see that the speed limit background changes, and then it values eventually to red. So let's keep it white for now because that's the base color, and I'm going to programmatically in my update function change the color of that background image to whatever the gradient evaluates to. So I'll start with background image color dot color is going to be equal to our gradient, the property that we declared earlier that's showing us that gradient. I want to evaluate this. So evaluate the percentage. Okay, and once again, that's happening every frame. Okay, so I'll maximize the play area here as we test it out. Okay, also let's make sure everything's wired up correctly. So on the speed limit container, there's the gradient, there's the background image color that I'm getting from the background game object, and I will run the game. And let's take a look to see if we have an indicator on the speed limit as we approach that speed. So right now we're in a 3-knot zone as we start the game. There's the 3-knot speed limit going 0 knots. So as we approach 3 knots, we should see some change happen here on the speed limit sign. So I'll increase the speed and just take a look. All right, it's going into the yellowish portion of the gradient. Getting into 2 knots, it's getting more reddish. And let's go ahead and go over. All right, so we get the event that gets triggered. We're over the speed limit, and our speed limit sign is trying to get our attention. So the gradient effect is working, as well as the last event that was programmed in from previous videos. I'll take the ship down below the speed limit. Okay, so look at that. Our gradient is adjusting because every frame it's running. So we're at 1.7 knots, and that's a safe speed based on the speed limit. Okay, so I hope that helps as far as seeing programmatically how you can use the gradient Unity component and get it to interact with game objects in your game. Take care.